All right. Okay, thanks for those of you who are here in person and for all of you online. We're in part 18 of our study in 2 Samuel and the story of David. And tonight and maybe 2 more weeks, we're taking up the part of the story that involves Absalom. So there's several chapters in 2 Samuel devoted to this, mostly 13 through 19. So we're looking at 2 Samuel 13 through 14 tonight. I tried to cut the reading as short as I could, but it's still a significant amount of reading. But I still think, I mean, you know, if we don't do anything else, at least we sort of hear the text, hear the story. So I'm going to take the time to read portions of 2 Samuel 13 and 14. Okay. Some time past, David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar, and David's son Amnon fell in love with her. But when she brought them near him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, "Come, lie with me, my sister." She answered him, "No, my brother, do not force me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do anything so vile. As for me, where could I carry my shame? As for you, you would be as one of the scoundrels in Israel. Now, therefore, I beg you, speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." But he would not listen to her, and being stronger than she, he forced her and lay with her. Then Amnon was seized with a very great loathing for her. Indeed, his loathing was even greater than the lust he had felt for her. Amnon said to her, "Get out." But she said to him, "No, my brother, for this wrong in sending me away is greater than any other that you did to me." But he would not listen to her. He called the young man who served him and said, "Put this woman out of my presence and bolt the door after her." So Tamar remained a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house. When King David heard of all these things, he became very angry, but he would not punish his son Amnon because he loved him, for he was his firstborn. But Absalom spoke to Amnon, neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had raped his sister Tamar. After 2 full years, Absalom had sheep shearers at Bel Hazor, which is near Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. Then Absalom commanded his servants, "Watch when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, 'Strike Amnon,' then kill him. Do not be afraid. Have I not myself commanded you? Be courageous and valiant." So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons rose, and each mounted his mule and fled. But Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Ammihud, king of Geshur. David mourned for his son day after day. Absalom, having fled to Geshur, stayed there 3 years. And the heart of the king went out, yearning for Absalom, for he was now consoled of the death of Amnon. Chapter 14. Now Joab, son of Zeruiah, perceived that the king's mind was on Absalom. Joab sent to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman. He said to her, "Pretend to be a mourner. Put on mourning garments. You do not anoint yourself with oil, but behave like a woman who's been mourning many days for the dead. Go to the king and speak to him as follows." Joab put words in her mouth. When the woman of Tekoa came to the king, she fell on her face to the ground and did obeisance and said, "Help, O king." The king asked her, "What is your trouble?" She answered, "Alas, I'm a widow. My husband is dead. Your servant had 2 sons, and they fought with one another in the field. There was no one to part them, and one struck the other and killed him. Now the whole family has risen against your servants. They say, 'Give up the man who struck his brother, so that we may kill him for the life of his brother whom he murdered, even if we destroy the heir as well.' Thus they would quench my one remaining ember, and leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the face of the earth." Then the king said to the woman, "Go to your house, and I will give orders concerning you." The woman of Tekoa said to the king, "On me be the guilt, my lord the king, and on my father's house. Let the king and his throne be guiltless." The king said, "If anyone says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall never touch you again." Then she said, "Please, may the king keep the Lord your God in mind, so that the avenger of blood may kill no more, and my son not be destroyed." He said, "As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground." Then the woman said, "Please let your servant speak a word to my lord the king." He said, "Speak." The woman said, "Why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in giving this decision, the king convicts himself, inasmuch as the king does not bring his banished one home again. We must all die. We are like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up. But God will not take away a life. He will devise plans so as not to keep an outcast banished forever from his presence. Now I have come to say this to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. Your servant thought, I will speak to the king. It may be that the king will perform the request of his servant. The king will hear and deliver his servant from the hand of the man who would cut both me and my son off from the heritage of God. Your servant thought, the word of my lord the king will set me at rest. For my lord the king is like the angel of God, discerning good and evil. The Lord your God be with you. Then the king said to Joab, very well, I grant this. Go bring back the young man Absalom. Joab prostrated himself with his face to the ground and did obeisance and blessed the king. And Joab said, today your servant knows that I found favor in your sight, my lord the king, and that the king has granted the request of his servant. So Joab went to Geshur, and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. The king said, let him go to his own house. He is not to come into my presence. So Absalom went to his own house and did not come into the king's presence. Now, in all Israel, there was no one to be praised so much for his beauty as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. When he cut the hair of his head, or at the end of every year, he used to cut it when it was heavy on him, he cut it. He weighed the hair in his head 200 shekels by the king's weight. There were born to Absalom 3 sons and 1 daughter, whose name was Tamar. She was a beautiful woman. So Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem without coming into the king's presence. And Absalom sent to Joab to send him to the king, but Joab would not come to him. He sent a second time, but Joab would not come. Then he said to his servants, look, Joab's field is next to mine. His barley is there. Go set it on fire. So Absalom's servants set the field on fire. And Joab rose, went to Absalom and his house, and said, why have your servants set my field on fire? Absalom answered Joab, look, I sent word to you. Come here, that I may send you to the king with the question, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to be there still. Now let me go into the king's presence. If there's guilt in me, let him kill me. Then Joab went to the king and told him, and he summoned Absalom. So he came to the king and prostrated himself with his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. All right. What stands out to you? Have you noticed there? Questions does it raise?
The family's a mess.
Yeah.
It is. My goodness.
It's a mess, but it's kind of a believable mess.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Believable in what way?
Well, you could rewrite it and set it today, and I think it would still be believable. Believable in that you can understand the emotions that are causing each person to do things.
Yeah.
Even setting fire to the field.
Right.
Yeah. Getting
somebody's attention.
Yeah. And Tamar.
Yeah, there's a lot that still feels very relevant
Right.
to our experiences today. Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Anything else stand out to you? Okay, so let's take up the first narrative surrounding Tamar. So this is number 2 on page 87 of the handout. This quote from commentator Bergen. This narrative forges another link in the tragic chain of sin begun in chapter 11 last week, as David's firstborn son and heir apparent committed an incestuous rape, so Amnon. The parallels between the king's sin and that of his own son, Amnon, are numerous. This is an interesting parallel here. Both committed immoral acts outside of marriage with beautiful women, in that they're explicitly described as beautiful. In the privacy of their own residences, both women experienced great grief, we're explicitly told that, because of the man's actions. And ultimately, both transgressions brought about death for sons of David. Amnon bringing about his own death through Absalom. This carefully constructed narrative seems intended to demonstrate at least two truths. First, that God's prophetic word is true, and second, that the sins of one generation imprint the next generation. So it does feel like the narrator wants us to see in the Tamar narrative something of the David and Bathsheba narrative.
Mhm.
In his readiness to compromise Tamar's virtue, however, Amnon was implicitly pagan. To emphasize the point, the biblical narrator deliberately patterns the portrayal of Amnon's actions and emotions after Shechem, an immoral Canaanite in the Torah. Shechem, like Amnon, was the firstborn son of a ruler who also raped the daughter of an Israelite leader and ended up dead. So that the commentator is suggesting that the narrator's written this in a way that, like, those who are in the know would say, oh yeah, this guy's acting like a pagan. Tamar's use of the phrase should not be done and of the term wicked thing are an unmistakable allusion to the Torah's account of Shechem's rape of Dinah. So we see in Tamar someone who knows the Torah and who's attempting to say, let's not make that story this story. David encouraged and rewarded his virgin daughter's sexual purity by providing each of them with a status-laden, richly ornamented robe. Tamar had been wearing the distinctive dress of a royal virgin daughter when she was raped, but afterwards she tore the ornamented robe. So it's not just that she rent her garments in grief, but this very symbolic, richly ornamented robe given by David to his daughters is what she's carrying. So, question here: this story clearly sets the stage for the estrangement of Absalom from David, because that's, I mean, the rest of the Absalom narrative builds on that Absalom is estranged from David. So the Tamar story certainly explains a bit of that. Why else do you think the narrator might have included this story? And what do you think we learned from the Tamar story about things like lust or power?
That once again, the women don't have any.
Right, yeah. They're, once again, a woman is treated as an object, less than human.
I think it always makes me struggle with the idea of that, because of even David's response to Amnon's raping of Tamar, that, you know, David's a man after God's own heart. That really, you know, causes pause with me sometimes.
Especially, I mean, when we consider that David did nothing to punish Amnon because he was his firstborn, he says. But then when Absalom does what he does, you know, he gets the silent treatment for
Years.
5 years, maybe. Yeah, a long time.
Years.
Yeah, it's interesting.
There's two tracks of justice, I think, that Penny alluded to. You know, she gets shamed and he's just a rogue. He's a scoundrel.
Yeah.
You know, and she's marked for life. And well, you know, I guess you can be, you know, scoundrel is almost like he's a bad boy. You know, there's no shame.
Boys will be boys.
Yeah.
Right.
A
Well,
little bit.
obviously nothing happened to him.
Yeah.
And that one of the questions. But anyway.
Okay, let's press a little further here. So the beginning of the narrative does seem to focus on lust and power, but the bulk of the narrative is really seems to be about anger, revenge, reconciliation. And so those are the themes that we see throughout the rest here. Absalom's anger at Amnon, his actions to avenge Tamar's trauma, David's anger at Absalom and his actions to punish, and Absalom's actions to punish Amnon. So Absalom nurses this anger against Amnon for 2 years, which is, to me, is quite remarkable. That he holds on to this for 2 years, waiting for just the right set of circumstances to take his revenge in the most extreme way possible, the death of Amnon. And David seems to easily overlook Amnon's reprehensible behavior simply because he loved him, for he was his firstborn. Almost like that, just, oh, it's okay, he's the firstborn. Comment by Bergen: the scheme of Absalom began innocently enough, as Absalom requested that the king and his officials please join him at Baal Hazor for a time of celebration. Absalom's request was a calculated one, since David's acceptance of the offer would have ended his chances of killing Amnon during the event, which is interesting. The commentator suggesting that had David said, "Oh, sure, yeah, I'll come," then Absalom may not have been able to kill Amnon. But the gamble paid off, as David graciously declined Absalom's petition. By this, Absalom succeeded in manipulating his father into a defensive position of social obligation that almost forced David to say yes to the next request, which came without delay and with the appearance of innocence. If the king himself wouldn't come, then let him send my brother Amnon, the king's heir apparent. So Absalom really does seem to be quite the conniving guy here, trying to get all the pieces in place to take revenge. The revenge must have seemed doubly sweet to Absalom, for he had succeeded in using the very same tactics to destroy Amnon. So another parallel here. The very same tactics to destroy Amnon that Amnon had previously used to destroy Tamar. So consider this. Like Amnon, Absalom had deceptively manipulated the king into ordering one of his children into a trap. Then, in the midst of a meal, he had overpowered the sibling and carried out a violent and wicked fantasy at their expense. So perhaps we're intended to see a parallel between Absalom's treatment of Amnon and Amnon's treatment of Tamar.
Yeah, because Absalom's had 2 years to think about this.
Yeah.
And when you plot revenge, or I wouldn't even, maybe he didn't even plot it for 2 years, but when you try to sit on something for a long time, and because David didn't do the right thing and took no action, and then you're just left to stew on it for a long time. And then you do come up with some interesting ideas as you're decided you can't get over this, you're not going to get over this, somebody has to punish him. And then you start thinking, I'll just plot along the same way, Is this a reasonable amount of time for a plot to come together like that?
Yeah.
To be thought of like that. It's probably thought of numerous ways to do it.
Yeah.
And you decided on it.
But you let enough time slip by to make people think that the coast is clear.
Right.
Oh yeah.
So
Right.
you just wait
Yeah.
and think that it's all over and done with, and everybody's guard goes down,
That's right.
and they
That's
didn't
right.
suspect a thing.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
Mm-hmm.
Adnan probably wouldn't have come earlier because he would have been, they were at odds and he knew they were at odds. But now he thinks, oh, well,
No, it's done deal.
it's over. He's forgotten about her.
Yep.
But he didn't forget
Water
about her.
under the bridge.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is interesting.
That's what I would do.
Okay. If I receive an invitation for 2 years from now
Right.
from you,
Just don't cross me.
That's right.
You
Just know where you stand.
That's your limitations.
Know where you stand.
I'll know I have 2 years left.
That's right. And then don't go.
Don't go.
David understandably remained in a state of grief over the death of his oldest son for quite some time. During David's 3-year period of grief, Absalom lived in exile at Geshur, In fleeing Israel as a young man to avoid the wrath of a sitting king, Absalom's life paralleled that of his father, Saul. The younger David had once been forced to live as a refugee in non-Israelite territory to elude King Saul. So another really interesting parallel.
Right.
David as a young person flees to non-Israelite territory to avoid the king. Now David's son does the same thing to avoid David the king.
Mhm.
So how do we explain the difference between David's response to Amnon and his response to Absalom here? I mean, does it make sense, or what do you feel like's going on there?
I'll let the parents in the class
Parents?
decide that, that blindness that we have for kids.
Yeah, you don't treat, sometimes you don't treat all your kids the same, you know?
Yeah.
You just don't feel towards them all the same. And especially, you know, they have different mothers, and sometimes they're
Mhm.
probably quite different kids.
Mhm.
And I also think that, you know, this is probably not that unusual in kingdoms to have a son on the outs with dad and having to stay in another kingdom. It was probably happening to a lot of places. It just
Mhm.
seems like a thing that is, there's always that tension between the princes of whatever and the king. But
Yeah, there may be a lot of factors at play there. I mean, we could argue at the beginning that David did nothing against Amnon because Amnon's the heir,
right. Well, he didn't have to
perhaps,
kill him.
but
Could have done something.
right, yeah, it could have done something. Okay, so Joab decides to get into the mix here. Joab, son of Zeruiah, David's nephew and the commanding general of Israelite forces, had walked with his uncle through the deepest valleys of life and climbed with him to the heights of power in Israel. Because of his lifelong association with David, he knew how David thought, and in the present situation, Joab knew that the king's heart was upon Absalom. So David seems to be wrestling with two contrasting emotions: desire for his son Absalom, and some sort of sense that he must punish Amnon. In this case, the latter emotion wins out. How do you deal with similarly contrasting emotions toward others?
Well, I don't know if it's age or laziness or wisdom or what, but I don't really feel like I'm in the punishing business anymore.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you kind of hope you reach a point where you feel like you're done with that.
Maybe if they're all in the family business, you feel a little differently. You know, if you all
Yeah.
have a family business and people are making business decisions or
Yeah.
something, you know. So they're not, I mean, our kids, they go off and they earn their living some other way. And so you don't, you know, they have a certain amount of distance
Mhm.
from us.
Right.
More so than families that are all entangled financially as well as in power.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, David was the lead scoundrel. And it's
Yeah. Right.
not like he didn't do all the same stuff.
Yeah, it's just some of the same stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe he has a softness for the weakness, his own weakness, and he forgives it more likely in his son's weakness or whatever.
So it may be easier for him to forgive the sin of Amnon than it
Amnon.
is to forgive the sin of Absalom.
Right, because he identifies with it a little more.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, because David did repeatedly, in terms of he and Saul, he had lots of opportunities to kill Saul and he never took it.
Right,
But here's Absalom taking the life of
right.
Amnon. That is interesting. Yeah. Okay, so Joab decides to step into the fray and try to get the king to talk to Absalom. So he uses a strategy that was used successfully by Nathan. So another
Mhm.
interesting
Right.
parallel here to the David and Bathsheba's story. Someone would obtain an audience with the king, seek judgment in a fictitious situation, let the king pronounce judgment, and then compel the king to apply the judgment to himself. So Nathan does that exact same thing regarding the sin, David's sin against Bathsheba, and now Joab, perhaps seeing how effective that was with David, does the same thing here to try to move David to bring Absalom back. So in choosing this method of seeking to influence David, Joab implicitly acknowledged the power of human art, in this case, the dramatic arts, for shaping the lives of people and so transforming human society, which is kind of interesting there. In the lengthy 93 words in the Masoretic text, speech that follows, the woman of Tekoa revealed the central thesis of her presentation before David. By failing to restore Absalom to the court of Jerusalem, David was acting against the interest of the people of God. For if, as it appears from the text, Absalom was the heir apparent to the throne, then keeping Absalom in exile threatened the fledgling dynasty of David, and thus continuation of quality leadership for Israel. Speaking as a sage of Israel, the wise woman of Tekoa then juxtaposed two profound truths about life. First, she noted that death is a hallmark of the human condition. And second, she noted that although God requires every person's death, he does not try to take away life. Instead, he devises ways so that a banished person may not remain estranged from him. What was it, do you think, about these fictional performances, Nathan's and now the woman of Tekoa, that seemed to be so effective in helping David gain greater self-awareness when it came to his negative behaviors?
Obviously, David could see much more clearly in somebody else's case than he could in his own. He was always seemed to have a big blind spot in his own. Which is true anyway, because you always know the extenuating circumstances of whatever you did yourself, to excuse things or whatever. You're like, well, but in somebody else's case, when it's put out there and you get just the facts or whatever, and you're like, oh, I can,
It's pretty clear.
It's clear. It's
Yeah.
clear. That person's in the wrong, or that person, whatever.
Yeah.
But you have.
We can declare ourselves.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Much
Yeah.
easier. And they didn't have movies or,
Right.
or TV series or whatever, so they were left with oral reports, I guess, mostly.
Yeah. I mean, Joab almost puts on a little play here.
Yeah,
I mean, Nathan was just, hey, I'm going to tell you a story, but here
Right.
Joab actually gets this woman to act out a scene
right, which
in front of
is
David.
giving me all sorts of pause anyway. Because he's like, she's called the wise woman of this, and then he puts words in her mouth. And and is this just guy, could she not have said something on her own or something? I don't know. I mean, it's obvious what he wants it. And why does he wants it reinstated? Because he's close to Absalom?
Joab?
Yeah, why does he want him reinstated?
I don't know, I think that's a good question. Because here he acts toward that goal to have Absalom and David reunited, but then immediately following this, he works against it because he won't come and talk to Absalom.
Right. So he's kind of complex.
Yeah. I mean,
At first, don't you think at first it sounds like he's doing it because he thinks David wants to reunite? He said his heart is longing for Absalom.
yeah.
But I
So
love it at the end when he praises David, like you're the smartest person in the world, just about, so you'll make the right decision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That always helps.
Right,
Little sugar there.
that's right.
Yeah. You're an angel, what does he say? You're like
Right.
an angel of God in discerning good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so maybe
Then the king says, all right, I'll do it.
Yeah, so maybe Joab's moved by what he sees in the heart of his king.
Yeah.
Right.
So I gotta do something. I gotta step in here and I gotta make this right. But then having done so, it's like he thinks a little differently. Maybe not. Has there ever been a time when a movie or a piece of art or a TV series or a book helped you gain greater self-awareness, either positively or negatively?
Oh, yeah. Sure.
Absolutely, and
Yeah.
it was always, seems like it's always because whatever I'm viewing or experiencing strikes a chord with me. It's, something in my life, reliving some sort of aspect of my life.
Mhm.
The Godfather.
Over sky.
We want to ask what part.
Yeah.
I used to have a horse.
Well, Laconia, that's what good storytelling does, right? I mean, it creates space for people to consider their own stories in light of that story.
Yeah, I believe that. I was thinking of a book called In a Different Voice by Carol Gilligan. I read that book in 1982 for my master's degree program, and it reframed my views on women and men. Prior to that, I'm still working on my stuff, if I can say it that way, but that book just opened my eyes to how different men and women are.
Hmm. Yeah, so while it's clearly not the main point of the story here, it is interesting that we find this same method used twice back to back here, once by Nathan and now once by Joab, and can generate some good self-reflection on the power of the arts.
Yes.
Right. I gotta take just a second here and plug my computer in before it dies. So give me a little bit of grace.
Oh no, power button.
All right. So moving on, why did David refuse to see his son Absalom after permitting him to return to Jerusalem? So Bergen. Perhaps a major reason was David's desire to imitate the Lord's example in dealing with Cain. Though the Lord spared Cain's life, Cain went out from the face of the Lord and apparently was never again in the presence of the Lord. Since David had previously relied on the Cain narrative to guide his judgment in this matter, it was consistent for him to bar Absalom from his face as well. So this commentator is suggesting that the Cain story is informing David here. Maybe. The biblical narrator's effort to describe Absalom's physical attractiveness is extraordinary and serves a thematic purpose. Previously, the theologically oriented narrator has taught that people are not to look at outward appearance. Instead, they are to imitate the Lord by looking at the heart, right? That's how this whole story starts. Absalom's physical appeal assured that those untrained in godliness would be beguiled by him. In so doing, however, they would blind themselves to the Lord's way and will. The narrator's emphasis on Absalom's appearance subtly warned of impending tragedy both for Absalom and his followers. So once we hit that line in the narrative, presumably we should be thinking, uh-oh, something bad's about to happen. Because we're being told what a good looking guy is.
It's a setup.
Yeah, it's a setup.
Mm.
Yeah. Absalom chose the name Tamar for his beautiful daughter. Interesting. Apparently as a gesture of sympathy for his desolate and humiliated sister who resided with him in his residence. And while this act may have been viewed as thoughtful and affirming by many, it had the effect of perpetuating painful memories in David's household for another generation. It's an interesting proposal there. After tolerating 2 years of quiet frustration and internal exile, Absalom decided to bring it to an end by implementing a plan to restore fellowship with his father David. Since he couldn't approach David directly, he sent for Joab in order to send him to the king. Joab repeatedly refused to come. The king's son ordered his servants to go to Joab's field of barley and set the field on fire. According to the Torah, Absalom would have had to reimburse Joab for the lost harvest. But Joab would have to come to him before he could get it. Absalom's plan to force a meeting with Joab worked, and Joab dutifully went to the king and told him of Absalom's ultimatum. So Absalom's power play worked. After 5 years of separation, so 3 in exile, 2 in exile in Jerusalem, the king summoned Absalom to come before him. With all the humility of a lowly slave, David's son came into the king's presence and bowed down with his face to the ground. However, David did not treat Absalom as a slave, but as an equal. The king kissed Absalom. This act demonstrated both David's respect and acceptance of his son. Reconciliation had occurred. So Joab is willingly involved in trying to help David to reconcile with Absalom, but he is unwilling to help Absalom reconcile with David. So when he sees the pain in David's heart for Absalom, he steps in to help. But then when Absalom calls for him, he doesn't go. Any more thoughts on why that would be for Joab? What's going on with Joab here?
I wouldn't want to get in the middle of all of that.
Yeah,
Like avoid it.
he seems definitely on, he seems much more on David's wavelength than Absalom. I mean, or maybe once he brought Absalom back and David wasn't up for reading him, or whatever, he was fine with that. Or he probably knew what Absalom wanted. I'm still tripping over the beauty. I always trip over the beauty in the Hebrew text, because they use that a lot, and they always tell you whether somebody was beautiful or not. Which I think, well, a lot. I'm not saying both men and women, but they seem to have they take great notice of that. Whether good, bad, different, but it doesn't go unexpressed generally.
Yeah, it means something. It's intentional.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you're trying to teach your kids that, beauty's on the inside and all that stuff. Yeah. It's like, oh. But I mean, it doesn't always work out great. It's all look good. But... Right.
It does seem to be a nod backward to the description of Saul a bit.
Right. Yeah.
Where we might think, uh-oh.
I had a friend that named their son Absolom. I was like, oh, so that's gonna lie.
Have you read the story?
And they had it. He was our minister in Utah, and they named their son Absolom.
Well, poor Absalom.
Well, anyway.
So Absalom goes to great lengths to express his anger toward Amnon, this 2-year plan. And here he goes to great lengths to try to be reconciled with David, even setting a field on fire and presumably compensating Joab for it, knowing that Joab would come to him for the money. Why? Why does Absalom go to all these great lengths? I mean, he seems to be a person of epic gestures
Yeah.
here. Why?
That's 2 years of quiet frustration.
Yeah.
That's about his
But-
breaking point, apparently.
I heard people are complicated.
Yep.
Yeah, I think 2 years is about his mark.
I mean, the first one there, his anger against Amnon, it does seem to be the case that it may be motivated by his feelings toward Tamar,
Mhm.
this great injustice that has been done to her. And then in terms of trying to be reconciled with David, you know, I just wonder about that. Does Absalom, we know David feels deeply for Absalom. What does Absalom feel for David? Is this relational or is it more political?
We don't know.
Yeah, we certainly don't know yet.
Or are we seeing a reflection of God? So God loves his children. His children are trying to, one way or another, reconcile themselves with God. Sometimes they get it right, often they don't.
Mhm. Yeah, it certainly reveals the messiness of reconciliation.
Yeah.
And the cost of it, the patience required for
And the humor.
it.
I mean, you know, it's a good story.
Mhm.
I mean, you have to know that that's a big gesture. Go set his stuff on fire. He'll come in. You know, I mean, that sounds like something
Smoke it-
people would
smoke it
say
out.
now, you know? I mean, it's like, hey.
I know, Kathy, you've never used a weed dragon. It's wonderful.
You guys pull your weed dragons out.
Right, but it just sounds like a good way to get his attention, you know?
Mhm.
So, because he's being snubbed, he's being rejected, but it's also kind of humorous too, you know? Which,
Yeah, I suppose that no secret is made that this fire has been set by Absalom's servants. Joab knows, right?
right,
They don't go out in the middle of the night under the cover of
Right.
darkness.
right,
And Joab wakes up thinking, what happened? How did this field catch on fire?
right.
And what
Well,
He knows.
Yeah,
It's like the weed dragons have, you know, Absalom's fire company written.
right. Right. Yeah, he knows where to go to get reimbursed, you know,
Yeah.
or whatever. He knows how it came to pass.
Someone set your field on fire? Better
Yeah,
call Saul.
yeah, you know, you,
Also,
yeah. But
Have you ever gone to great extremes to seek reconciliation with someone, or has someone ever gone to great extremes to seek reconciliation with you? Anybody ever set a field on fire for you?
no, didn't set a field on fire. But
well, I'm betting that we do it more often than we think. And sometimes it works as we imagine, other times it backfires.
Mhm. Right, sometimes you use intermediaries and sometimes
Yep.
that works well and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
Either
There
way.
can be drama and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't.
Right. Sometimes you pick the wrong intermediary and it really goes south. Just saying. Saying.
And I think, you know, on David's side here, I mean, it just occurs to me that there's something that's very realistic about that, just in terms of seeking reconciliation with somebody who's difficult in your life. You know, you take a step toward that reconciliation, and then, you know, maybe it feels painful, and you
Right.
maybe start to have second thoughts, and so you keep some distance there
Right.
in place. And it may take someone else to finally say, it's been 5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Let's close this.
But in the meantime, on our screen, I can see Eddie right in the center, and it reminds me, God is looking on all of it. He's looking on to David. He's looking on to David's family. He's looking on to all that they did, but God still loves them all. And what did God try to do? He tried reconciliation also
Yeah.
with his people. And it didn't work out as well as he'd hoped, but he didn't stop trying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. That's a good point.
Or he hasn't stopped trying.
That's right. It is an ongoing process. Okay, we'll stop there. And so next week and the week after that, we're staying in 13 through 19 of 2 Samuel, just sort of following these Absalom narratives out. Okay. So everybody, thanks for joining us online. Very good to be with all of you tonight.
Sweet dreams, everybody.
Good to be with you all.
Bye, good
Bye,
night.
Penny.